Okay, so one of our featured speakers is Tim White. He's going to be talking about natural building and sustainable building today. Tim has over 3 decades of expertise revitalizing natural building practices and has earned distinction as the president of Texas Healthy Homes. Most recently, Tim and his team won the U.S. Hemp Building Association's 2022-23 Best Hemp Building Award for completing a 2,400 square foot house utilizing hempcrete. Tim will be speaking about how natural building systems create a healthy medium for people and the environment. Tim will also help us explore how and why natural building can move humanity in a more sustainable direction, rooting us forward to a sustainable future for body, mind, and spirit. Please welcome Tim White.
Thanks, y'all. This is going to be kind of audience participation as we go through here. So you might be called on to raise your hand from time to time. When they first asked me to present up here, they were like, what would you like to talk about? And one of the things that we've been experiencing out there in the world is the toxins in the built environment, in the modern building materials. And with my company, when I was in Colorado building, and then now in Texas and looking at coming back to Colorado, we'd always been looking at the materials that we were using, and we finally came to the conclusion that we're not using any toxic materials. So we just started to be like, well, let's just call it what it is. So we're Texas Healthy Homes. There's a lot of people that call us about that. There's a lot of people that have called us and wanted us to build houses in Oregon, Washington State, California. Literally, when the guy called me from California, I'm like, well, why are you calling me? And he's like, I have spent 2 years researching and talking to green builders, green architects, and I understand the difference between green building and the toxins in green building systems that are there today and true natural building. And I'm like, well, yeah. I mean, you live in California. He's like, there is nobody that builds like you guys do with natural materials as a contractor trying to do projects. There's lots of people out there that are doing do-it-yourself projects and stuff like that, and that's really one of the hurdles that natural building to become mainstream we have to overcome is do-it-yourselfers are great, but when they do a natural building search, they get every style of hobbit house that you would ever imagine, and then the clients are like, I don't want a house like that. So when you see our web pages and our Facebook pages and our projects, they're flat walls. We had a project down in Bayfield, Colorado that was a straw bale house, big 3,600 square foot, 2-story straw bale house. And we had plastered the outside, and it was a Hispanic drywall company, and they pulled up the long driveway. It was way out in the middle of nowhere. And then they turned around and then they drove out. And then 15 minutes later, they came back and they're like, we're looking for the straw bale house. And we're like, yeah, it's right here. And they're like, no, this is not a straw bale house. Your walls are completely flat. And we're like, well, go inside because there's no plaster over the bales. And so it's that perception that we're battling out there in the world over what's being done with natural building and what we're trying to showcase and show. There's a big push to bring natural building into the mainstream. But we also know in doing that it needs to look like a track home, because it's going to be sold 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 times. And that's not a problem for us to do. But getting back to my topic of natural building equals sustainable building. I was involved in a conference up in Oregon a month ago with the industrial hemp sector and the USDA on trying to figure out how do we promote and get more industrial hemp grown by the farmers so the farmers can get diversity. And a lot of it came out of there at the end of the day that in hemp building or in building something better, that sustainability out there in the world most people don't care about it. They could care less. It's really not moving the needle. And what we need to do is we need to move the needle. And so they were talking about sustainability of being regenerative. Well, yeah, that's true. Ease of repairability makes a building easier to keep around for 500 years instead of what we have in our modern construction industry where all of our houses are going to get a major remodel in 20, 25 years. And if they're around in 70 years to 90 years, they plan on tearing those buildings down and rebuilding a new building where the buildings are that we're building today. It's really quite crazy. So in looking at this, I was like, natural building equals sustainable building. First off, we have to figure out in that equation, I'm a big equation guy. Who here has ever heard of Occam's razor? All right, look around. Out there in the audience, if you don't know what Occam's razor is, you can ask one of these guys later on. But basically, it's the simplest equation is the correct equation. We find when we get into natural building that we're dealing with an organic-based monolithic wall system, cob, adobe, straw bale, hempcrete. All those materials are low carbon footprint. The straw and the hemp are really great at pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. There was a study that I saw on that CO2 sequestration, and hemp was an 83 and straw bale was a 79. You know, on like where that scale is and how much they're pulling out every year. And me being a natural builder and have built good 20 straw bale houses or worked on them or built them from ground up, you know, decade and a half ago, was like, wow, we were really headed in the right direction there. You know, the only problem with straw bales is you are susceptible to how strong the bale is when you buy it, and you're also susceptible to any mold that might come in to the building system as you're building it. It's like the straw bales that you guys see out here. If I was to build with them, I wouldn't. You know, they're not bright straw. You know, if they're kind of a tanner color, there's some organics in there. And if you put it in a light straw clay or a cob type of a structure and it takes a long time for it to dry, it has more of a chance to have a mold bloom in it. And the last thing you want inside of your monolithic wall system that's organic based is a mold bloom, you know.
Can you describe the straw you use?
Bright and shiny. Yeah, bright. Light colored, yellow, looks like there's no organics. It's not orangish in color. To the point that when we build now, we use hempcrete because we're trying to promote that for the farmers out there. But we use lime in our clay plasters, and we don't put any organics in any of our plasters anymore. I don't put any organics in my floors. You know, it's all sand gradation, clay, or lime. I've had some pretty major lawsuits with mold in walls where I've used organics, and so I'm trying not to reproduce that problem. It was so much fun the first time. And so that is the thing with the wall system that we're using. You know, we're using an organic monolithic wall system. We're using usually lime or clay. Lime is in the lime cycle. It's sure it has a CO2 emissions with it when it's burned, but at the back end of it, it's pulling CO2 as it's turning back into limestone. Portland cement. Portland cement is what we call in the building sciences kind of a dead product because it's been burned at such a high temperature for so long that the base aluminum, silica of the clay, the carbon, the calcium carbonate of the lime, they get burned at such a high temperature that they completely disassociate molecularly, and then they form back into a clinker, and that is a chemical gel that they take the clinker and they grind it into a fine powder, and then when Portland cement as we know it hits water, those gels, I mean, they literally explode under a microscope, but they coat everything. It becomes a dead product. It's not pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. It loses its repairability that we used to have with the lime. It doesn't interact with the building envelope like clay does, which we'll get into here in a little bit. It's a thermal conductor. concrete is. The reason engineers like concrete and steel together, they work perfect for them, because the expansion and contraction coefficient of steel and concrete are exactly the same. So if you got concrete and steel in a skyscraper, if you got concrete and steel in a bridge or a foundation, and it's heating up and cooling down, those materials are expanding and contracting at the same rate. And it works really great. For me as a building scientist, I'm looking at it as like, wow, if they got that in common, what else do they have in common? One thing that we're noticing is that concrete gets hot really fast and gets cold really fast. You know, thermal temperature likes to fly right through it, like water likes to go through sand, you know, compared to earthen material, which has got a time lag. When you get to lime, it's still a mineral. It's got a dual reflectivity to it, so it's not a thermal conductor like concrete and steel are. And so when we start to talk about our values with the hempcrete, you know, everybody's like, oh, but it's this and it's that. And I was like, yeah, but you can put it under a 3-hour fire burn test with 2,700 degrees on one side of it, and on the other side of the 12-inch thick wall, the temperature doesn't change for 3 hours. You know, so what's the true R value of it, you know? In the American testing standards, 2 inches is what you get to test for your R value sample. You know, it's not a true test of the material. And that's one of the challenges that we're facing out there in bringing products to the marketplace, is that the testing protocol does not fit the parameters of our material. There's not a single lab that we can take a 12-inch hempcrete wall to and say, give us a R value for what it takes for the temperature to change through this 12-inch wall. They will only test 1.5 inches or 2 inches of that material. And so it's not a true representation of the product in the marketplace. Very frustrating, and is that it's not a problem here, that's a problem in Europe. And there's a guy named Sergey. He's Hempshire is his company, and he's out of the Ukraine, and he's a big hemp guy. And when Sergey and I get on the stage together, holy cow, talk about getting the riot in Rome fired up. I mean, we're both, I mean, he is like awesome with the toxins and everything like that, which we'll get into. So basically in natural building systems, we want to go back to the historic building materials that have a track record of thousands of years. They were mainly wood, clay, some sort of organic wall system, and lime. Sometimes they were using gypsum, especially in the temples and in that, so it's still in that natural kind of base material. But really, at the end of the day, those are your 4 or 5 basic ingredients for your house or for your building. Clay, lime, wood, and some sort of organic monolithic wall system that we're going to create. What's beautiful about all those products is that they can be sourced locally. In 1900, there were 1,200 independent lime companies in the United States. 1,200 individual little lime kilns that you could go and get your hot lime and slake it and make your binder. Today there's 5. Okay, the Portland industry has come in and taken them over, shut them down, bought them out. And so now for us to get like a pure hydrated lime, there's very few places that we can get it. And the Chemstar type S type of a lime is actually designed for use with Portland cement. And usually when we get into doing lime stuff, we want a really high calcium lime that's really pure that we can manipulate. So it's even getting harder for us to source our raw materials. The clays are great, depending where you're at. I did an Adobe floor class last weekend down in southwest Colorado, right outside of Cortez. We dug the clay with a skid steer, not even from me to you away from where we actually used it, you know, and we got the sand from right down the road. It's not always that case. In Texas, it's really hard for us to find clay up in hill country because it's all limestone. On the other side, in Texas, their frost line is 2 inches, so it makes it really easy to do foundations. It's really nice, actually. So The lime we talked about, the aggregate material that we can source for our plasters is usually fairly local. We like to use a lot of recycled glass sand. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, actually, I could get it really easy out of Durango Recycling Center when I was building down there. Today, I cannot find it. The recycled glass market has fallen out of the American public. It's really, really great. In our big business plan of an umbrella that we would like to have to take over the world, in that, as part of our business plan, is setting up a glass recycling facility so we can get that hard, sharp, angular aggregate, so we can create local economic development, because then we can employ 5, 8 people to go around and set up collection for glass, set up the processing that thing, and try to get some jobs back in the American market. I mean, that's a huge thing. Natural building equals sustainability. Okay, so next we're going to move on to clay. And I'm going to move down here in the shade, out of the sun. Otherwise, I'm going to burn up. Clay is an amazing thing. It's found everywhere. When we go to Mars, I mean, we're taking compressed earth block machines and we're making compressed earth blocks to build on in Mars, because Mars had liquid water. Okay, if you got liquid water and you've got erosion, you're going to be making aluminum silica. So there's clay on Mars. Okay, it's there. We don't have to take it there. I've been talking to some hempsters, and they're like, "We're taking hemp to Mars," and I'm like, "Just take a compressed earth block machine, and find some water. It's right there. You don't need anything else." Clay is an amazing product. Clay carries a negative ionic charge inside of its makeup. So it's able to interact with the bipolar properties of water vapor. So first off, who here knows about negative ions and how good they are for human health and our human body? So raise your hands high, because everybody else who doesn't understand it, you need to talk to these people, okay? Because that is not my realm, okay? I just know that in the science that we've done on how water vapor, our thermal energy of steam, interacts with clay, that the clay inside of your building envelope will absorb that extra steam at the latent heat flux of vaporization, is what it is on the scientific level of it. It will absorb that thermal energy of the vapor of humidity in your building envelope and absorb it into the wall and pass it through your organic wall system, and it can actually pass it through the other side. The walls aren't breathable because they're not like a living creature where they're breathing. The walls allow water vapor to move through them. And as soon as you put some sort of synthetic or some sort of vapor barrier on it, it stops. And that's where it condensates. And if you get a temperature change, that's where you're going to get your condensation building up, and that's where you're going to get your mold to start to grow. And so the clay is really good at controlling humidity and temperature in a building envelope dramatically. It wants to be between 45 and 65% humidity, and it wants to be between 60 and 72 degrees naturally. That's what the clay is trying to equalize in your house. And so when we talk to people about building their natural house, or we do consulting and they're going to do blocks and they're worried about the walls dusting, we're like, well, you should have a good matrix of your material first off, so you're not going to get dusting. And I've seen projects that are complete beautiful compressed earth block adobe houses, and the clients were worried about dusting when it wasn't taking place in the first place. And so they put a synthetic sealer over the inside of all of their compressed earth blocks. Well, now that house in southwest Colorado is freezing during the winter, and it's hot during the summer, because now all that mass of that clay can't interact with that water vapor. And so now they're having to import external electricity in order to control their humidity and temperature. And so the clay is really amazing at being able to control its own humidity and temperature. And that's why I mentioned yesterday, like, for somebody getting into natural building as a conventional builder, a baby step is keep doing exactly the same thing you're doing. Just stop where you're going to take it to an orange peel texture on your drywall and just put clay plaster over top of it. I have put, oh my God, at least 100,000 square feet of clay plaster over drywall, ceilings, drywall, and everything. And if every time I go and talk to my other natural builders around the country, the first question I'm asking them is, have you had a mold problem in your drywall, in the sheetrock, with clay plasters on it? None of us have ever had a problem with mold in our drywall as long as it doesn't have a latex paint underneath of the clay. So everybody's like, oh, I want to get rid of drywall. I want to get rid of drywall. I want to get rid of drywall. It's a problem. It's a problem. It's a problem. The drywall is not the problem. It's the plastic latex paint, because that's all latex paint is, y'all, is liquid plastic. All right? So we need to wrap our minds around that first off. Okay? Which is a hard concept to wrap your mind around, because what does every homeowner do the first time they buy a house? They repaint their house. You know, it's like in Mesa Verde. They have a room in Mesa Verde that's got 24 different coats of clay plaster on it. And everybody's like, why so many coats of clay plaster? I was like, because that was, there was new families moving into that all the time. And the first thing she wants when she moves in is to make it her own place. And so he's got to go out and buy paint or get a clay plaster and clay plaster it. I mean, it's just human nature. We're no different than those humans back then. You know, we're the exact same species. So the same cultural stuff that we have taking place is taking place to them. By code for vapor barriers, it all depends on where you're at and where you're at inside a code. Yes, they want a vapor barrier. There are ways you can use an historic lime plaster system as grandfathering it in to that system. I did a straw bale project on the other side of Pagosa Springs, still under Pagosa's code in that county. And this was many, many years ago. And it was that big, huge straw bale house I mentioned earlier. And Bob Giselle was the guy building it. Bob has passed on now. But when Bob talked to me, he's like, and this project is like an hour and 45 minutes away from where I live in Mancos, Colorado then. And I was like, Bob, I cannot contract this that far away. We will subcontract the bales and the plaster work, but I'm not contracting this house that far away. And I had a new wife and a new baby, and yeah, my life was stressed as it was. They stamped all the plans. They put the foundation in that fall because they were slow getting it going, and they started the construction the next year. Over that winter, that county adopted the new international building codes, okay? But the plans were already stamped. And when it came down to it, when we were getting ready to do the plaster on the outside, and the inspector came to do an electrical inspection, and he was like, hold it, you need to do a vapor barrier on those bales. And I was like, well, let's see here. So I was like, go get the building plans. And we rolled them out on the back of the truck, and I was like, is this your guys' stamp for the permit? And they're like, yeah. There's no vapor barrier on these plans. Correct. But we just accepted the new natural building, or the new building codes, and you need to do a vapor barrier. And I was like, well, first off, we're not doing a vapor barrier, and you stamped this, so we're going off of what you stamped, and I don't care that you guys changed the code over top of it. You should have pulled that permit then, you know, so he couldn't do it. And the inspector got so mad at me that he left, called the architect, and the architect was kind of conventional architect, looking at playing with natural building, and she's like, Tim, you know, code is that you need a vapor barrier. And I was like, we're not putting a vapor barrier on here. It's not happening. She's like, well, then you need to take responsibility for it. I was like, no problem. You write up something that says that Tim White and Mountain Stream Builders will take complete responsibility for this house molding because we didn't put a vapor barrier under the caveat that at no time in the future will there be a synthetic sealer or a non-vapor permeable sealer applied to the outside of this building. And I go, then I'll sign it. And she goes, well, how can you do that? And I'm like, because I'm an archaeologist and I've studied what we've done in the past and I'm reproducing what we've done in the past. And those buildings have a track history of hundreds, if not thousands of years, you know? So if you're not going to be brave enough to step up to bat and say, I'm going to do the same thing that they did 5,000 years ago or 500 years ago, you know? And Bob Dizelle, after that, he comes up to me and he goes, Jesus, Tim. And I was like, what, Bob? He goes, this is why I paid you. And I was like, what? So I could get in trouble? And he goes, no, because I know you and where you stand, and I know that there was no way in the world you were going to let a vapor barrier be put on this straw bale house. And I was like, heck no, not at all. I go, I just wish you would have let me known that the inspector was coming today for the electrical inspection, because we would have not put our wire up on the house today. We would have waited until he was going to be gone for 2 weeks, and then we could have done our wire and we could have got our scratch code on it, and they never would have known anything at all, you know. So that's one way that we deal with vapor barriers, because vapor barriers usually not are an inspected item on a checkbox in most building coded areas. Depends how heavily coated you are and what inspections they want. Usually it's a framing inspection, you know, for structural load, a roofing inspection, and they're usually not inspecting your drywall. They'll inspect your plumbing and your electric, but they're usually not inspecting your pre-stucco work or your pre-plaster work, and they're usually not inspecting after your drywall up is to make sure the drywall is hung correctly. Now, if you're in Austin, Texas, they're going to inspect all of those phases. And to pull a permit in Austin, you not only need an engineer stamp, you also need a licensed architect stamp. So immediately, every single project in Austin, Texas has an extra $50,000 to $75,000 price tag on it just for those two stamps. Yeah. And they're like selling 1,500 square foot houses down there for $1.2 million, you know. We've thought about building a bunch. I can't stand the Austinites, to tell you the truth. It's just the traffic, and it's just like, oh my God, you guys, can you please come down to earth here? That being said, in 7 years, I did 2 clay plaster jobs in Austin, and that is it in 7 years. In Durango, Colorado, running a natural construction company around Durango, Colorado, I did 1 clay plaster job in Durango in a dozen years. You know, all of our natural building projects are in areas outside of that, with people that are more conscious wanting to do it. When I get into these heavy liberal communities, it's like, holy cow, y'all, you guys are supposed to be the promised land, and we can't even get a simple 200 square foot clay plaster job as a accent wall on a wall, let alone getting paid to come in and work on a commercial project to do clay plasters in a skyscraper, you know. Another beauty with the clay plasters is in controlling that humidity and temperature. You're able to control how much energy is needed to maintain a good living conditions. And so I've been pushing for 15 years with architects and designers in cities that they need to do a skyscraper with clay plasters, you know. Because if you could get a skyscraper with clay plasters, and when you do clay plasters in a house, say you're cutting your consumption of your energy by 10 to 20%. Well, if you cut an electric bill out of a skyscraper of 20%, we're talking millions of dollars a year, you know. It doesn't matter. It's just over drywall. Yeah, well, you can put clay plasters over drywall all the time inside of a skyscraper. That's what they're going to do. Yeah, and so when you get an earthquake, the drywall cracks. Yeah. Well, in clay, you just go in and patch it. You know, it's no big deal. We're not talking about building a straw bale skyscraper or an adobe skyscraper. Yeah. You know, we're just talking about a clay veneer over top of it. If I could get a skyscraper, I would go just be gone. I'd just go put clay up all day long. It would make my life so happy. Yeah. You can do clay plasters right over top of latex paint. Yeah, and next weekend we're doing the Crestone Energy Fair is putting on an interior clay plaster workshop, and I'll be teaching that, and it's going to be using it's a finished clay plaster class, and we're going to be using some of the American clay product and making some local product, but that in that process we'll show how to go directly over latex paint. Done a lot of it in remote. Done it a lot. No, it's not preferable. Preferable is a monolithic wall system with natural materials. Um,
Or
and,
drywall, I mean, as far as,
yeah,
there's something you have to do to cover the latex.
with the latex, it all depends on your skill set with it. You know, American clay in their process, and some people say go out and do it sanded primer. Get some fine volcanic sand and put a primer coat on it. Um, I'm a plaster. I'm not a painter. So we put our binder in our clay, and we know when we can put it on, how to put it on, so that we can get it just to lay up, and then we'll let it dry, and then we'll do another coat the next day, and it sticks to that wall. Um, the only time it seems to want to come off is if you pick up the drywall and then you drop it like 8 feet, you know, and then sometimes it will want to pop off. If you do that to your house, you're going to have a lot of different problems also. So, you know, um, it's really cool what you can do with the clay and how you can use it as a remodel. And that's what I really push when I'm out there is like, hey, there's another low-hanging fruit. You can just put clay plasters over your drywall, and you're going to incorporate the natural temperature control of the natural earthen material. You're going to get those, what did we talk about that the clay has? The negative ions. Oh, I do it all the time. Yeah. We clay plaster ceilings all the time. We use the American Clay and Hari product because it's super easy. It's got sand and clay in it. We use their binder. We put a coat of it up. Then we come back when it's leather hard and we sponge finish it. And then that's it. We're done. And this is the beauty when you're doing it over drywall, is that we just prep, we do fiber mesh, and then we just do 2 coats of a hot mud over top of our seams and our corners. We do not sand, and we do not put any drywall mud over top of our screw holes at all. None. Okay? So we've taken that drywall prep process from 5 days and shrunk it into an afternoon. Okay? And then you don't have the orange peel texture, you don't have the primer coat, you don't have the 2 coats of paint. So that's another week. We're coming in 2 days after we prep our drywall seams, and we're putting our clay plaster over top of it, and then we're usually finishing it that day or the next day. So we're able to come into rooms, prep them one day, come in 2 days later after it's set up, and take them to a finish. And so we're finding that our product costs more, but we're on the job site less. So that's where you make it. And a lot of people, when they're like, oh, we priced out the clay plaster and that stuff's expensive. It's way more expensive than paint. Well, yeah, it's way more expensive than paint that you get at Home Depot. But if you go to what is it over in Durango, the Handcrafted House, they've got a natural, no VOC type of paints that they have. And they're not cheap, you know. But also, if you take the orange peel texture and the 4 steps of sanding and drywall mud out of it as part of the cost of doing the application of getting a finished wall, now you're almost to a complete wash as far as the cost goes. Let's see. It depends on how you finish it. If you smooth polish it, it's going to bounce sound. If you leave it a more sandy finish and you do a textured finish on it, you know, so there's more surface area on it, it will take that sound and bounce it off. You know, so it will dissipate that sound instead of bouncing off of a hard concrete wall or a hard lime plaster wall. We do not do lime finish plasters inside. They don't interact with clay. They don't interact with the moisture inside of the building like the clay does. And they're harder, so you get more of that sound bouncing off of everything, whereas the clays are a lot softer. They don't get me wrong, they look beautiful. the clay plasters are just so beautiful to work with, and the cleanup with them is just so easy. And we don't really like to work harder than we have to. We do all our lime plasters outside. And then when we get to doing showers, we do a Cadillac lime shower. So we get to a seamless shower, and that's where we use that material. One more, yes, sir? It's all clay. It's all clay. I've got a book called a book out there, Living Spaces. It's a German book. In that book, it talks about where moisture problems come from. It also talks about the carbon footprint of different materials per pound. The book that I have is from the 90s, right at the turn of the century. But they say in that book that non-open porous materials in a bathroom should never be used. So the tiles, the paints, the wallpaper, all the stuff that we're doing in a bathroom is what we should not be doing. We should be using earthen materials in that bathroom so they can absorb that extra humidity and then release that humidity out through the space. And when I was with American Clay, and back then we had a bunch of distributors wanting to jump up, and we were training them, and they're like, "You guys are so full of it. There's no way this clay can hold up inside of a shower." So we had a little 2-foot by 2-foot piece of drywall that he put clay on, and then he put it in his bathroom on his, next to his sink, and he turned the hot water on in the shower, and he turned the hot water on his sink, and it was all still latex paint. And he shut the door, and he's like, "I'm going to let those run until that clay absorbs so much water that it runs down the drywall," because it was an open pore surface. When he had 1/8 of an inch of water sitting on his floor from the water, condensating on his latex painted walls and running down the walls and accumulating on his floor, and there was no sign of it accumulating on the clay, and the clay was still nice and strong, he decided maybe he should stop his experiment. Living Spaces. Most of the clay that American Clay has is around 2 credit cards to a credit card thick over drywall. Super thin veneers, and they've got a number of products for a number of different finishes. It can be a little complex, and that was one of the things that got me in trouble when I was working for them. I was like, "You need to make this system simpler. This is hard for me to follow, and I'm a professional natural plasterer. So how does a drywaller or the gypsum guy follow it, It can be complex." Yeah, and that's what happens when you have a nail hole and then you pull it off, or you have some place where it got scratched. What happens is that moisture gets in behind there and condensates, and it gets really wicked. If you have a cold ceiling, it's going to condensate on your floor, and if you have a cold floor, it's going to condensate on your ceiling. And the Lower Sioux guys up on the Lower Sioux Reservation in Minnesota, they came in and did a remodel and did their sprayed hemp in an old building that was there. It was one of the first buildings that was built on the reservation back in the 1900s, and there was an addition. And they went in and ripped all the drywall and everything out, and there was a section that got damaged because somebody ran into it with their car. But when they did that remodel back then they did latex paint, or they did plastic underneath the drywall, and every place where there was a nail hole that went through it, when they tore it out, that's where the black mold was starting to grow with that behind that plastic in the wood and in the fiberglass. And so it was really apparent to them, with them moving into doing hemp and learning about lime and wanting to learn about clay plasters, it's like, hold it. This is where it all went wrong. We were doing great up until about the 1860s when we started. Benjamin Moore and Sherwin-Williams started to make their paints. They came out during the Civil War. Well, the reason they started to come out during the Civil War is Rockefeller, with his oil and stuff, when they were refining it, they had all this waste product, and they needed to figure out what to do with it. And they're like, "Oh, well, let's see if we can make this out of it as a wall covering, so we can give our pioneer women diversity in what type of color they want over top of their walls and their house that they're building." And that's where it started. The next big catalyst of mold growth inside of a modern house happened in 1982 when they made lead illegal in paint. What we're finding is that all the paints and the caulks after 1982, when they made lead illegal, are systemic mold growing machines, and so as we get to it's the red stuff that they use when they're doing tile and stuff like that in modern remodels and stuff like that, is that what we're noticing when we come into these projects, these modern projects, is that the moisture condensates, and then once the moisture's condensating, then we got a medium, we got food for the mold to grow, and then the mold starts to grow, and we're finding that it's eating the modern petrochemical-based materials that are full of toxins, and then the mold itself becomes toxic. And so it's this wicked cycle that we have going on. And once you get to the consciousness of that, and you can break that chain and just say, we're not using it, all of those problems go away. It's just completely incredible. And for me as a natural builder, with almost 3 decades of natural building, it's hard for me to believe, okay? So when I talk to people out there and modern architects and stuff, and they have a hard time believing it, and I go, I understand. It's hard for me as a natural building scientist to believe it, but once you strip it down to the facts, if you're brave enough to look at the facts, you will find the truth, And so it's just being able to be like, okay, this is what it is. What can we do? So I get a lot of people that are like, we don't want to use drywall. And I'm like, the drywall is not the problem. It's the latex paint that's the problem. And then as far as pushing true sustainability, resiliency, I look at it as a carbon footprint. At the end of the day, we got to look at the carbon footprint of the building materials that we're using. Recycled building materials are great. They've got a low carbon footprint. They've already been produced. We're just recycling them at that point in time, The natural building materials that we're talking about are great with their carbon footprint. In that Living Spaces book, we said we were at a hobo camp, and that's what we set up if we're on a remote site working, because a hobo is not a bum. A hobo is a traveling craftsperson trying to find work for their trade. And so we set up our little hobo camps. They're great to an extent. If you've got a cook and a counselor, it's awesome. If you don't, it's going to be a rodeo show. Hang on, y'all. But we wanted to see what it was like on a carbon footprint scale if we replaced 8,000 pounds of reinforced concrete in a slab on grade with 8,000 pounds of adobe or cob. And so we went through the book, and we found that reinforced concrete and steel was 1,200 British thermal units per pound. And then we found in that book that cob was 60 British thermal units per pound. And then we took that equation into 8,000 pounds, and it ended up being like 7.5 million British thermal units of energy we didn't need to use inside of the house. And at my last hempcrete workshop that we did in Texas, we had a guy that came from from Louisiana, and we were showing him that data, and he's really conscious. He became a vegetarian so that he would not eat 2 beef cows in his lifetime, so he could reduce his carbon footprint. And he's like, I'm going to go back to eating meat and start to do adobe floors because you just displaced more BTUs of energy than I am if I eat these 2 cows. And I was like, yeah. He goes, oh man, I can't wait to have a steak. But it was like, when you start to look at that, it's like, wow, this is a lot of energy that we did not need to produce. And if we can get to the point that we can start to look at it on a bigger picture of what don't we have to use, what's the carbon footprint of the material that we're displacing that we don't have to create, now the whole dropping the CO2 emissions in the atmosphere is a whole different game. just with the material selection. And so I got to deal with architects all the time. So maybe that's why I'm so brave. But they're like, well, what's the architect of this century going to be weighed and measured and tried on? I go, well, last century you guys were the Frank Lloyd Wrights, and you guys are still trying to be that guy. Only thing I know about Frank Lloyd Wright houses is they all have systemic moisture and mold problems in every single one of them, okay, across the board. So great modern architecture, but as far as like making a livable house that's low carbon footprint that needs very little repairs and remodel, true resilient building material, pathetic. I mean, completely pathetic. But these modern architects have jumped on that and they've ran with it. And I'm like, the architect of this century is going to be who can make a simple design for a simple household, because that's what we want to start with, and is going to have the lowest carbon footprint for that house. Those are the ones at the end of the century we're going to be researching and writing books around, the architects that went to incorporating mass timber design into their skyscrapers, went to incorporating a natural, organic, monolithic sort of wall system, went to using lime plasters instead of cement, and trying to incorporate earthen materials that all of it can be recycled. Really easy, super resilient. So that's my rant on architects. If there's any architects out there, please raise your hand, okay? I want you all to know you all have a lot of work to do as a profession. There's very few in the trades and engineers that actually like you, okay? So as architects, that's just one truth that I found that is across, I thought that the trades, the electricians and the plumbers and the builders disliked architects. And then I started talking to some engineers and I was like, holy cow, you guys are, holy cow. Talk about like racist or prejudice or something like that, or just complete disdain. I'm like, okay. But we went to, inside of our company at Texas Healthy Homes, and when I was in Colorado, we do our own design work, because we know that we want to get a good overhang. We want to get our foundation up out of the ground so that our water's moving away from the house. And if you can accomplish that, you're 95% of the way down to a successful longevity of a building. But if you got no overhangs and your bottom plate is 2 inches off of your finished grade, we just did a project like that down in Texas, 3 years ago. And they're like, well, why is moisture coming in through our concrete slab? Well, let's see. Your water is that far below your bottom plates. It could just run right in. And you have no overhangs. So it looks cool, but man, the systemic maintenance problem on that thing is crazy. And on that, for that lime plaster that we did on the outside, the contract came with a warranty is null and void because you do not have overhangs on your house. I'm not taking on responsibility for you not doing smart design. Covered clay, covered adobe floors, covered lime, resiliency, regenerative, being able to recycle everything to build another house. And before I take some questions, a couple of things I want to say about me as a natural builder. For me as a natural builder, one of the things that we tell all our crew when we bring them in, because we go through a lot of crew, is that you've got an opportunity to do something that nobody else gets a chance to do. You get the opportunity to work on a house that is going to be here after you're dead and gone. Hundreds and hundreds of years. So, don't be just here for a check. Be here to do good work. Concentrate on what you do on this project that you're working on. You're going to get a paycheck. And this house is going to be here. And nobody in the modern building trades can ever say that unless they're building a skyscraper that's just steel and glass. The second thing is I'm always having to go back and remind myself that for me, it's an honor to be able to work with the materials, because it's not anything that everybody gets a chance to do. To actually be able to work with the natural materials that are good for you and healthy for you and not toxic to your crew is it's an honor. And so we're always trying to honor that aspect of it. And then the other thing I'll say is when I was down in New Mexico at a Adobe USA conference, and it was back in '07, there was this guy, and he was character, man. He got up there, and they were doing these round, sacred geometry type of a stuff. And he had a guy on his crew who was from one of the Pueblos. And when they were making their adobes, he had a drinking problem. And when they were making their adobes, he wasn't drinking. He got his life back together. And then when they went and started to do the cement mortar that they were putting them together, which is completely the wrong thing to do, and then they were doing cement plaster on the outside, he started drinking, fell off the wagon to where the guy was like, I had to let him go. And he's all talking about this energy stuff. And I'm like, at the end of the presentation, I raised my hand and I was like, I understand and I get your story, but have you ever stopped to think about the energy of the material that the people are using and the energy of that material going into your workers and how they behave? Because you're sitting up here walking around, handing out all this stuff and acting like, the sacred geometry is the greatest thing in the world and you're all on this other level, but you're missing the whole level of the energy in the building material and how it's affecting the people that are working with it. And everybody in the audience clapped. And I was like, oh no, I'm that guy again. It's like, okay, bringing out just what the truth is. And that was a real eye-opener, I hope, for the presenter. But it was a real eye-opener for everybody at that Adobe USA conference to be like, hold it. There's more taking place here. And this guy just gave a perfect example of it with his worker, but in giving his example, he wasn't conscious enough inside of the consciousness of the sacred geometry that he's pushing to actually see the energy of the different material and how it's affecting people in their lives and in their aura. And at the end of the day, we're just bags of electrically charged salt water, At the end of the day, that's all we are. And we got this tumor called a brain, that was some sort of evolutionary quirk that developed for us to actually think and interact with our environment and make conscious decisions and get into writing and all the problems that writing has and creating this linear control thinking, take over the world creatures. It's a wicked cycle. But any other questions around natural building?
We have one right here, Tim.
Okay, yes,
And
ma'am.
just so you know, we've got about 10
Oh, right
minutes.
on.
Okay.
I've been able to
Okay.
make my way through here.
Okay, thank you so much, Tim.
Mhm.
I think natural building is a super important subject. Thanks for giving us such beautiful insight and your passion. And I really promote non-toxic living. We have a lot to think about, reading labels, and I'm still on the Dr. Bronner's kick.
Yeah.
Can use it for shampoo, white vinegar for cleaning the house. So another low-hanging fruit, do you encourage passive solar design and daylighting? Because that really is a great foundation,
Yeah.
I think.
So we design all of our houses with passive solar. In Texas, we design them with a covered east porch and small windows on the west side. Because there's one thing in Texas that you don't want to be is on a west porch. You just don't want it. So we design it with east porches. We design with passive solar design and limiting the amount of glazing that we have over the whole house. So all of our houses have smaller windows on the north side, good solar design on the south side. It's different than passive house. Passive house is a green sort of lead thing that's come out into the world, and passive house is more about incorporating a section in the house that will you will use as heating and cooling, and then you move that air when you need it around the building. And so when Passive House came out, I was like, what in the world are y'all talking about? Passive solar? And they're like, no, it's different. And I was like, oh my God, you guys are just making this more confusing. Can we please stop making it more confusing? And worse than that, can we please stop changing the definition of the word? I mean, Texans are famous for their lakes. They have one natural lake in the whole state of Texas, and every single reservoir, they call it a lake. You know, when my daughter moved down there and she was like, oh my God, these Texas and all their reservoirs, calling them lakes. And to where in her freshman year in high school, the biology teacher was like, well, there's really nothing negative about reservoirs. And my daughter, who grew up in Colorado, was like, yeah, there is. And they're like, well, what would it be? And she's like, well, let's see. A lake has got a nice watershed all the way around it at the same level and greenery all the way around it, and it's got water flowing through it. And a reservoir has a stagnant, dead body of water that goes up and down and has something called a dead zone around it, you know, and it's zebra mussels and the whole 9 yards. And so when we start to change the definition of the vocabulary of the word, we start to change the concept inside of our mind. And that's really taking place right now with inside of green being natural and green being energy efficient. And it's like we're not really measuring the carbon footprint of the foam and all of those things that go into it. So, right. Well, you know, it's low VOC. Come on, give me a break. It's healthier. You know, it's more energy efficient. And, what was I going to say on that? So more and more, the more I've been in it, and the more I've looked at what the climate talk is, and everybody with climate change, and everybody on their different political sides of the whole spectrum of it, I'm finding that the climate thing is just creating friction inside of it. You know, there's us that are conscious, are like, holy cow, we're like really screwing this thing up here. For me, it's not so much about climate change anymore, because it's so politicized and it can be in so many different directions. To me, I'm finding that the big corporations have no problem creating this racket around carbon footprint and letting us fight it out over CO2 and climate change and everything like that. As long as we don't do one thing, and the one thing that they don't want us to look at is the toxins in the built environment. They do not want us to start to talk about the toxins in the built environment. Because as soon as we start to talk about toxins in the built environment, now we got to talk about building code. Because building code is around health and safety, okay? That's what they sell us, right? I mean, architects, engineers, health and safety. Structural, health and safety, GFIs, it's healthier, it's safer. Well, okay, no problem. Let's go health and safety. What are the toxins inside of that product that you just incorporated, and what are they going to cause with the people inside of that building envelope? What happens when we drop all that stuff inside? Why do we got cancer going crazy? Because we are reluctant to look at the fact that it's a health and safety issue with the toxins. There's 20 to 30,000 different toxins in a modern house. Yeah. So question.
Yeah, we're really tight on time, and I don't want to cut into George. So we have time for a couple more questions, but if you can keep it short, we really appreciate it. No worries.
I feel like one of the big issues about trying to incorporate natural building into like larger cities and more urban environments is around codes, inspectors, cities. I think people want to start transitioning more into sustainable methods, but I think they need to be educated. So my question is, have you had luck with or success stories, aside from the one you told earlier, with cities and counties with trying to educate them on natural building and getting houses that you're trying to put up approved?
Yeah. This is really cool. This is when I was building with papercrete blocks, and the reason I built with the papercrete blocks is there was a company that was making them. Donovan Spitzman's got his project that's on the house tour every now and then. But they were an example for me to show that a cellulose weight-bearing building block was a possibility, and we built 10 buildings like that. When I first moved to Texas, we had a developer that was looking at using those blocks in Austin. So they set up a meeting and they're like, Tim, can you set up a presentation? And I was sure. Here's your fire testing. Here's your structural testing. Here's the basic testings that they would want to know about. So we had a meeting, and it was in the high rise where City of Austin's got their head inspectors. Head inspector of the city of Austin, head fire inspector, head electrical inspector, all sitting down around the conference table, passing around the blocks, passing around the information in a pamphlet that we put together for them. Said, and then when we do our electric, we channel it out so it's 1.5 inches buried into the wall, so that it meets code. Right then, the electrical inspector stopped, and he goes, "What did you say?" And I go, "We channel it out so that the electric wire is over 1.5 inches buried into the wall." And he goes, "I'm sold. The sheer fact that you know what that code is lets me know as a head inspector that you're going to make sure that that detail is on the architectural plans so that my inspectors can go out there and they can look at it on the plans and be like, okay, now I can do a checks and balance on it." The fire burn test, no fire over 3 hours on it, no smoke whatsoever. The head fire inspector was like, "Hey, we want this in here." The head inspector was like, "We want this product in the city of Austin." The inspectors at the city wanted it. The developer, it was going to be 25 cents a square foot more for their houses, for their wall systems, to use that material. And so that is what priced it out of where their comfort zone was with the material. 25 cents. And in Albuquerque, we were working with American Clay to get it into a development with their clay plaster, and it came down to be a nickel a square foot more, and that made them keep going with orange peel texture and latex paint. So out there in the world, that's what we fight with every day. And really, at the end of the day, every project comes down to the three C's, and not like CU, the C's: cost, color, and completion. If you can't nail those three things, it does not matter what you do. Okay? If you can't get it into his budget, if you can't nail her color, and you can't complete that project, it doesn't matter. And at the end of the day, it sounds really sad and pathetic that it comes down to that, but that is what every single one of my project comes down to, And the thing that I fret about overall is not hitting the cost and not hitting the completion of the project. It's making sure that that color on my lime wash, which is all natural made, right there on site. 5 gallons of our lime wash for our color coat usually costs us about $20, But if you don't nail her lime wash color, you're going to have heck to pay, because it's been like that on every single project, except for the ones that are like, "I want white." And I'm like, "Oh, that's like heaven," because white is what lime wash is. And we're like, "We guarantee that we will nail your brilliant white color every single time. But if you want something different, it's going to be different." Yes, sir.
So can you use bentonite clay as a plaster?
Bentonite clays are really cool because bentonite clays are all volcanic based, and their erosion off of a volcanic pyroclastic flow or pumice or ash fall or something like that, and then they get eroded into a clay. When you take and you blast that silica up into the sky out of a volcano, it gets supercharged. I mean, it's got a paramagnetic charge and electromagnetic charge that is out of control. That's why you will get some bentonite clays that are super expansive and some that aren't as expansive, and that's due to how long they've been a clay on the face of the planet. Are they, 500 million years old? Are they 1 billion years old? Or are they 40,000 years old? There's some really high charged, healthy bentonite clays up in the Dakotas that Arizona State University was using for ulcers and using them as a compress over top of it. And they couldn't find out what was going on with it. And I was like, well, go talk to the ag department and see what the paramagnetism is on that clay. And they're like, what are you talking about, paramagnetism? And I was like, yeah, you guys need to like, and they're like, well, we're not going to do that because our grant funding's over and it's going to be an unknown. I was like, oh my God, universities, please give me a break. Can you guys please do something without money attached to it? Can you really try to track something down because you have a passion about figuring out what in the world's in this bentonite clay that's able to put a clay pad over top of your gut and solve an ulcer? But
Is the more charged clay more ancient?
no, it's a fresher.
The pressure is more charged.
Yeah, because it hasn't been sitting there in over that time. There's a really good white bentonite clay down in Texas. It's called Del Rio clay. Really nice and white, like the coffee cup there. It is from an old caldera that is millions and millions, a billion years old. But it's not very expansive, and it's a beautiful clay to work with. But in American Clay's product, they've got kaolin, hawthorn, and a bentonite. And they use that bentonite for flow. I'm not exactly sure what that mine is, where it's coming from. Yeah. I've been up there and I was like, oh, really? And when you talk to engineers, and you mention to them that you can use clay as a building material, I mean, they look like you got 8 heads and 50 eyes, and you don't know what you're talking about. It's like a complete different concept, because to an engineer, the only thing clay is a nightmare for expansive soils, And as a natural builder, the only thing clay is a nice local-based binder that we can manipulate to build anything we want to with it. And so it's that concept. And so Bruce King with New Carbon Architecture and what he's been doing in his presentations when he's in front of engineers, he pushes them to look at clay as concrete. And so when we do our adobe floors, our base that we do to get a flat surface is we use concrete gravel, concrete sand, and clay as our binder. And we literally screed that first one. And every time I do it, I send him a picture, and I Facebook and I say, using clay as concrete there. Bruce, what do you think? And he's like, oh, Tim, you're the only one that takes me serious anymore. Any other questions out there before I go back down to the build site?
Jay, yeah. We've got 2 more I know that asked, and then we probably need to finish up.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
So I have a big hole dug for a basement, and I'm really curious, and I mean, I'm likely just going to pay you to come out and take a look at my property and the materials that are there, but I haven't gotten anybody to tell me how to do a natural, earthen basement. Everybody wants me to fill concrete blocks with concrete. So I'm curious what you would do with that.
Fill concrete. Okay. Is what I would do. Or what you could do is you could go down the earthship zone and do the tires. In the basement in this climate, I would probably push you in the direction of insulated concrete forms, the ICFs, instead of concrete masonry unit blocks, because you're going to get an insulative and it's got to be waterproof anyways. And then once you get above grade, you can do whatever you want out of that spot. And it's not the best, but it's going to give you an insulated basement. It's going to give you a waterproof basement, which when they adopt codes, because, sorry, Crestone, it's coming. All right, as much as we wouldn't like to not have it come, we can guide it as we go, but it's coming. I mean, because the corporations want everybody under code so that they can jack our interest rates up and they can jack our property value up, and that's just the game that we live in. America.
Hey there.
Yeah.
I'm over here. Oh, right in front of you. Hey.
Oh, okay.
Hey. I apologize if I missed the answer to this question
Yeah.
already. I was curious because I'm really interested in avoiding off-gassing materials in construction. I think that's really important. We work with a lot of toxic materials, which I want to avoid in the future. But I was curious, do you have any knowledge of any sort of toxicity related to concrete itself or Portland cement?
Yeah, this is a great question. And if you go to a concrete batch plant and those big metal cages that they have with the big plastic containers, and go read one of the additives that they have on there, and you will be terrified of what's in there. I mean, it's like, this will kill you. This will cause cancer. You know, in California, it kills all the rats. They're adding that to the concrete for all of our concrete slabs so they can get a higher PSI load on them. And so everybody's like, concrete, I mean, oh my God, in Texas, you can't go anywhere without a concrete slab going in. You know, and so that's why we do concrete for our grade beams, and then we do adobe floors. And then if it's a second floor, you can do whatever you want that's a less VOC-based material. What I will say in talking with Sergey, with Hampshire and what he's doing in the Ukraine and in the United States with hempcrete is that they've got a major problem in Ukraine. The major problem they have in Ukraine is that when they were under the Soviet heel, the Soviet Union came in and built all these concrete skyscrapers for housing, because part of communism is you're going to have a job and you're going to have a place to live. You might not like where you live and you might not like your job, but everybody's going to be working. You know, there is no unemployment or anything like that underneath that communist rule that they had. In order to do that, they built all these concrete skyscrapers. Well, one part of concrete is that concrete is on a pH of about 4, 4.5. It's acidic. Lime is basic. And what they're finding in the Ukraine is that they have a massive cancer problem with everybody living in the concrete skyscrapers. And the reason for it is you got concrete above you, below you, all the way around you, and it's a pH of 4.5, so it's turning the air acidic. So now, as a human being, we're breathing in acidic air, and cancer needs an acidic base to survive inside of the human body. And so one thing that they have over there is they've got a major cancer problem because the air inside of those buildings is acidic. And Sergey's so great. And he goes, you guys in America, you got a cancer problem because a whole different ball of wax you guys got going on. You know, with the toxins in the built environment, the toxins in our food chain, and everything like that. Whereas over there, it's the concrete that's giving them the problem with the toxins coming from it. And so that's why at Texas Healthy Homes and everything that Tim White has ever built, we're doing grade beams. We'll do ICFs for our foundation walls in Colorado, but then we're transitioning immediately from that material into adobe or into our natural wall systems. And so, yes, concrete is a situation. Yeah. Yeah, well, this Portland's going to give you an acidic base material, you know. And it's another thing with grounding, you know. If you got an adobe floor, you're going to get a lot better grounding than if you got a concrete floor, you know. And who here knows about grounding? Yeah. All right, look around. Yeah. If you want to know more about grounding, go talk to the people with their hands raised, because I'm not an expert on it in any way, shape, or form. But
I have a friend that builds with, I think, 90% lime and 10% cement.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be healthier.
Yeah, or what we do at Texas Healthy Homes is we use lime and then we go after different pozzolans that make Roman concrete. And so we're able to we haven't gotten to the point that we can make it as a foundation yet, but we're really close. It's the testing that is the terrifying part about that. But we're making Roman concrete basically at the end of the day. So we're able to get that same hardness and set without the Portland in the lime. Yeah, it's great. It's so much fun. I mean, clay's cool, but when I started to play with Roman concrete, I was like, oh, this is fun and exciting. Any other questions out there? I'll be down at the building site later if anybody wants to ask me any questions. And then next week, through the Crestone Energy Fair Natural Building Series, we're doing a finished clay plaster workshop, and it's geared towards everything from going over drywall to going over base, other types of plaster systems and materials, but it's all going to be clay finish plasters on that. So, and I'm around this whole next week too. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tim.
She keeps
I'm behind you.